Hey, let's talk about forestry practices. Okay, so the thing is, like people have used wood for a long time. As long as we've been people, really, we've been chopping down trees and using them to make houses and furniture, paper products, and things like that. So it's a renewable resource that we definitely are still very much in need of in this world. But the way we access it can be the difference between a renewable and a non-renewable resource. So basically, there's three different ways you can take lumber out, or basic ways. Okay, you can use what's called selective cutting, or the opposite of that would be called clear cutting. And there's an in-between one that we'll talk about called shelter wood cutting. All right, so let's just talk about selective cutting. So selective cutting basically means you're going to go into the forest, you're just going to pick the most valuable trees. Like this tree is worth a lot of money, it's really straight, it's got good qualities, I'll make a lot of money, I'm going to chop this tree and maybe that one over there, but I'm leaving most of the trees in place. Now, the thing about this is it costs the least amount of disruption to the forest ecosystem, but it's very expensive to get the trees out of there once you cut them. And so it's the least economical way of harvesting timber. So it's often not practiced, although it is the best for the environment. The opposite of this would be called clear cutting. And unfortunately, this is the most economic way to do it. Sorry, I'm going to have to wipe my nose. That was gross. Sorry. Okay, so this is the most disruptive because basically you're getting rid of the forest ecosystem, right? You're just clearing out absolutely everything. There's nothing left, no bushes, nothing, just down to bare dirt. But in doing this, it's just really easy to move the trees out of there. So it's the most economical way of doing it. And unfortunately, without intervention, this is the way most timber companies are going to harvest trees. Now, there's another way, which is called shelter wood cutting. And shelter wood cutting, basically, what you do is you leave trees of different ages. So it's got an uneven age distribution, and you're taking high value trees, but you're leaving a lot of the other ones. And you're taking about maybe a third of the trees. And so the trees that are remaining can be harvested at a later time, and they provide shade to the other ones, and they provide some continuity of the forest ecosystem, far less disruptive. So this is kind of a nice in between from the one extreme to the other, clear cutting versus selective cutting. So let's just talk specifically about clear cutting because that's something that College Board wants you to know about. We've talked about this already this year, so there's not too much that's new here, right? Okay, so basically, if you go in and you cut down all the trees and you're exposing soil, you know what's going to happen. First, you're going to have increased runoff, which means you're going to end up have more flooding events, and then you're going to have erosion because the runoff is going to carry soil with it, and that soil is going to go into the stream and increase the turbidity or cloudiness of the stream. Well, that soil has a lot of nutrients in it. So you're also going to wash a lot of nutrients into the stream, and that's going to disrupt the ecosystem in ways we'll talk about later in the year. The other thing is the water's just going to flow straight across the surface. So it's not going to get neutralized because it's not sinking into the soil. So the pH goes up. The soils lose all their moisture because they're just exposed to the sun. So the soil moisture content goes down. There's less light being absorbed and converted into glucose, so the temperature gets hotter. And then now what happens is you also change the amount of precipitation if you do this over a large area, say like in the Amazon rainforest. And also, obviously fragmentation leads to loss of biodiversity. So let's just look real quick. So runoff. So if you take the vegetation away, the water just flows down the hill. You see this is what turbidity looks like when it gets into the water. You get flooding events that wash out roads and houses. You take soil that was on the hill and you bring it down into the streams. Then this is turbidity gets in the water. So this cloudiness, it interferes with fish. It interferes with productivity. But worse, actually, is the nutrients that are carried in the soil lead to these algae explosions. And these algae explosions end up reducing the oxygen content in the water because when those algae cells die, bacteria eat them and you just lose almost all the oxygen in the water. So it's very catastrophic to dump that kind of nutrient into a riverine ecosystem. And the pH goes down. When the pH goes down, it basically goes down to rainwater levels. But normally, in most cases, rainwater washes into the soil, gets neutralized, and by the time it discharges into a stream, the pH has come back close to 7. But not when you take away all the chance of the water to infiltrate. And then also now that exposed soil is going to dry out. A lot of some fractions of it are going to blow away. So the clays and silts blow away, so it loses water retention, and you may not be able to recover that soil afterwards. And then without the trees to convert the heat to the solar energy to glucose, you get a lot of temperature changes that ordinarily forests are fairly cool, but these logged out places tend to be very hot when the sun comes out. And then there's a lack of transpiration. So lack of transpiration in a large enough system can also lead to a lack of precipitation. And fragmentation, as you see here, basically makes it difficult for, as we talked about with biodiversity, makes it difficult for species, especially specialist species, to survive, when especially with larger predators that need a lot of range. So this concept of clearing out trees, okay, we call it deforestation. Pretty easy to understand what that means, right? So deforestation in a developed country, say Korea, the United States, it's usually happening because people want to access wood for timber harvest. They want to, sell that wood product. But in developing countries, say sub-Saharan Africa, Brazil, basically it's being done to put in small subsistence farming. So, my dad had a farm. There's no room for me. I need a farm. I'm just going to go out in the forest, chop it down, and make a farm for myself. So this, as the population in these developing countries grow, deforestation tends to grow at a very rapid rate. And in places where you have tropical rainforests, unfortunately, if you recall, those tropical rainforest soils are very low in nutrients. And as a result of that, clearing away the trees doesn't do any good. So people engage in what they call slash and burn agriculture. They chop down all the trees and they burn them. And the nutrients that are in the wood itself get into the soil, but only for a short period of time, because you really don't have a fully developed nitrogen cycle. It's just there for a year or two and then it washes away. Now your soil is no longer productive. So what do? You chop down more trees. So you just have this constant cycle of people chopping down trees, burning them, planting for 2 years, and then moving on. And this is very much, I'm sure you're aware, having a huge impact on the Amazon rainforest. Let's see. Okay, so basically, clear cutting is just not a sustainable practice. It is treating wood, which should be a renewable resource, as a non-renewable resource. And the reason it's so particularly bad is because of the damage it does to soils. So one of the things we're going to focus on the second semester is the importance of soils. If you damage soils, you damage the future productivity of an area for as long as we can imagine humans will be around. So it's very important to protect soils. Very short-sighted to do that. Okay, so now we're going to shift. We're going to shift and we're going to talk about fire, because fire is something that College Board wants you to know about in terms of forestry practices, because fires can be a bad thing, obviously, but fires are often an important part of a natural ecosystem, and they're not necessarily entirely bad. So let's just get this straight. So first of all, forest fires in general are on the increase because of climate change. And it should be pretty obvious that if you burn wood, you're going to make carbon dioxide as one of the products, because it's just basically respiration from a chemical standpoint rather than a biologic one. And you're essentially dumping all this carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, which is exacerbating the problem with global warming. In fact, up to 20% of the CO2 that goes into the atmosphere each year, that's 1/5 of it is coming from forest fires. And that's growing as forest fires become more common because trees are drying out as a result of global warming. But it also plays an important role in a natural ecosystem, so especially in grassland ecosystems. Fires are really important there. They're also important in forest ecosystems. So it's not that they're necessarily bad or unnatural, it's just that the rate at which they're happening is the problem. So let's just talk about a grassland ecosystem for just a second, because they do ask quite a few questions about this on the test over the years. Okay, so the idea is, in a grassland ecosystem, when grass grows, it's an annual plant. It lives for 1 year. It dies, but it doesn't necessarily decompose right away. The roots do, but the grassy part doesn't. The upper part, the part that's engaging in photosynthesis, just sits there, and so there's all these nutrients trapped in it, right? And so these nutrients need to get returned to the soil. And so it makes it harder for new plants to grow. It makes it harder for grazing animals to access the new plants. And so it blocks light so new plants don't grow. But a fire comes along and all of a sudden it burns all that away. It returns the nutrients to the ground. The new shoots can come back up right away. And so it turns out that fires are a vitally important part of the life cycle in a grassland biome. And prairie fires are a very common thing. Lightning strikes when the grass is dry, there goes your prairie, but that's okay. It grows back quickly. A little bit different with a forest, okay, right? You burn down grass grows back up. It's an annual plant. These trees could be 1,000 years old. It takes 1,000 years to get back to where they were. That's a little different. But it turns out fire in a natural setting is not necessarily a bad thing. Here's why. There's two kinds of fires, basically. There's more than two. We'll just talk about two. You can have what's called a surface fire or a crown fire. And when you think of forest fires, you're probably thinking of a crown fire. The whole tree burns up, right? It makes the news. But surface fires are often very common. So surface fires are basically a good part of the ecosystem. So what they do is they don't burn the tops of the trees. They just burn the underbrush. They burn the fallen branches. They burn the dead bushes, and basically they clear away the understory, and they basically keep the amount of fuel that's available on the ground and dried out and ready to go in check, so that you never get these big crown fires here. So having periodic, every few years, having surface fires, it's a good thing and a normal part of a healthy forest ecosystem. Crown fires, on the other hand, completely destroy the forest ecosystem. They're devastating, and it takes decades and decades and decades to get back to where you were, anywhere close to where you were. So, so the thing is, humans have reduced the amount of forest lands to a significant extent. So we want to preserve them. So what we tend to do is we tend to go in and put out fires when they happen. I mean, my son's best friend, the guy with the my son with the motorcycle, his best friend growing up is a wildland firefighter. He goes in and he puts out these fires because what they want to do is they want to try to make sure that you don't end up burning down whole forests. So basically, when we go in and we put out these fires, unfortunately, what happens is we're allowing more and more of the fallen branches and stuff to pile up. And so we're just basically setting ourselves up for these devastating crown fire events that are going to happen when that fuel catches on fire. So one way, ironically, to prevent crown fires is to set surface fires when you know the conditions are such that it's unlikely for them to lead to larger fires starting. Okay, so forest management practices often involve monitoring weather systems, which way is the wind going, how dry is the environment, how likely is it for this fire to grow out of control, and if everything seems right, we'll start fires. Firefighters will go out and they'll actually start forest fires. And what these fires will do is they'll burn out all this stuff here, and they'll get rid of a lot of the fuel wood that would fallen off the trees and from dead bushes, and then that controlled burn keeps the forest healthy. Essentially, we're doing what nature would do, but we're doing it when we know it's unlikely to grow out of control. Nature doesn't do that, obviously, but because we have less forest around to do that, it's one way of managing it. Now, in the 1800s, and yes, College Board wants you to know this, in the 1800s, the United States government set up two big groups. They have a lot of them, but we'll talk about these two major ones in terms of forestry practices. They set up the National Park System and the National Forest System. And you do need to know the difference between these two, okay? So the National Park System essentially sets aside large areas of land, whole ecosystems, and says, look, this is a beautiful, important part of the world. We are going to protect it. We are going to prevent any kind of building here. We won't let people hunt here. We're not going to let people log or mine here. We're going to keep it in a natural state of beauty. Okay, that's what national parks do. When people travel to the United States, they always want to go to the national parks because they're wonderful things. Okay, it's a great idea that many countries in the world, including Korea, have copied. The National Forest System is quite different. Now, the National Forest System, its goal is to make sure that these forests, much larger areas that don't necessarily have that wow appeal that national parks do, they want to take them and say, look, we want to make it so that it is economically beneficial so people can log them. We want people to be able to graze their animals there. So if you have cows or sheep, you can graze them here. We want to make it so that people can harvest mushrooms here, that people can go hiking here, ride their horses here. We're trying to have multi-use, including economic use. And unfortunately, what happens often is the logging companies have a lot of money and they have a lot of sway. And so there's a lot of pressure that you see in the United States on the National Forest System to basically act as an even-handed arbiter of what's going to happen there. And one thing you find, and the College Board sometimes asks about, is that the National Forest System unfortunately has this habit of being pressured to sell forest lands for harvest at much, much reduced prices than what would happen on the open market. And that obviously is going to lead to excessive logging. So one of the things you can do to try to prevent excess logging is require this governmental agency to only sell tracts of forest land for harvest at market rates. You can't undersell it, but they often do in order to raise tax dollars and get politicians reelected. Now, when we go to managed forests so now we're talking about they're not wild anymore. We're talking about the national parks or national forests. We're managing these things, right? We don't want them to burn down, and we also want them to stay healthy. Well, apart from fires, one of the things that makes them unhealthy is diseases, and diseases can be either caused by bacteria, fungus, or insect infestation. Insect infestation is terrible, like the pine beetle, pine bark beetle is just terrible. You go to Yellowstone National Park to just see just miles and miles and miles of dead trees caused by this one invasive beetle species. And these dead trees are easily caught on fire, right? So it's very important to try to prevent that from happening. So one way they do this is using something we're going to talk about later in this unit called IPM, or Integrated Pest Management. Basically, IPM means trying to be very using data collection to make a modeling to make informed decisions about how much intervention to use in pest control. You have lots of options. You don't just spray pesticide, you know, out of the blue. So basically, what you do is you say, okay, we're going to thin the forest so we don't end up with too many. Say we're going to take out the dead trees or the infected trees. We're going to put out traps and monitor. You see this in Korea all the time. You see these trees wrapped in plastic where they're monitoring what bugs are there, right? If I'm getting, say, gypsy moths, a bad one, I'm monitoring to see if I have them. If I do, I might have to intervene. You can release sterile species, sterile bugs that will mate, but they won't get pregnant. Or you can put genetically modified ones that will, well, that's what I mean. Okay, but you can also put in uh, species that will attack the bugs you don't want. Or you can use chemical pesticides when you need to. So we're not putting it out of the blue. We're saying it's not completely off limits, but you don't want to use it when you don't have to use it. That's what the idea of integrated pest management. You can use pheromones, which is like sexual chemicals that these animals release in order to find each other. You can use that to trap them. Kind of cruel, but it works. And you can also use biological pesticides, which are basically bacteria that are naturally part of the soil, but you release them in the air and they kill the insects without killing, without introducing toxins to the environment. So you have lots of options, and basically integrated pest management means looking at your forest system and deciding based on your data what would be the best approach for reducing the amount of damage being done by insects or other pest species like funguses and things like that. And it's important that we have to do this because we have less wildland left, so we have to manage what we have. So there's a lot of debate in the ecology world right now as to what's the best approach. So you have basically two different sides of the argument. One side of the argument is, hey, hands off. These are natural systems. Let nature knows what to do. Let nature run its course. And other people are like, well, no, you got to manage these forests because there's not that many of them left, and they're really an important part of our economy and a lot of ecosystem services that are being provided by them. We want to protect that. And so there's this balancing act between them. And there's a classic example. I mean, in the 1980s, I think it was, maybe 70s, Yellowstone National Park just burnt to the ground. They said, hey, you know what? This fire is natural. Let's just let it do its thing. Well, unfortunately, a lot of fuel had built up, and the whole park, I mean, I never saw it before it burned, and I've seen it since, and the trees are kind of small, and it doesn't look anything like what it used to look like because this decision was one that, in retrospect, was probably not a great decision because there was just too much fuel wood on the floor of the forest, and they had this crown fire that burned the whole place down. Okay, thanks for watching. I hope I kept this short enough.